So over the last few weeks, we've been talking about things Jesus never said. And the reason why I keep saying over and over again why that's so important is because there's so many things that people believe that Jesus said, when in reality, he never came close to saying any of those things. And at an even deeper level, why this is important, why this is something we have to work through and we have to deal with, is because if people believe these things, then they live accordingly, right? Their lives are a reflection of what they think Jesus actually said. Now, if you remember a lot of the things we've talked about throughout these last few weeks, maybe for one example, we talked about where maybe people believe that Jesus said you don't have to forgive that person or forgive a person who's hurt you. Or maybe we think Jesus said that our sin isn't a big deal. We say, oh, I have a small sin in my life. It's not a big deal to Jesus. I can keep doing what I'm doing. When in fact, all sin is actually a big deal. So there's a lot of things that Jesus has said that a lot of people actually don't take seriously. They actually maybe take it a little more lightly than a lot of other people, and they begin to think, well, maybe he didn't actually say those things. And so it's important for us to really come to terms with, or come to grips with, what it is Jesus actually said, right? But we've been going through these various phrases of things people actually believe that Jesus said, so that we can come to a better understand what Jesus actually said in the scriptures. And so take these as an example. The first of these, it says, thou shalt not bear false witness. This is Jesus teaching. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor unless they are a Republican. Now, in our politically charged culture right now, it seems like this is the case, that people, not just Republicans, so I'm not just taking it that side too, but even with Democrats, that you go on Facebook for any amount of time, you see that a lot of people have a lot of political disagreements with each other, and they don't just disagree, they start calling each other names, they start lying about each other, they start gossiping about each other, name calling, all of these other kinds of things that people do to each other, all because of the big political climate that we're in. But we know that Jesus talks about how we're to love one another, that we are to be at peace with one another. But yet a lot of people, there are some things that they maybe don't take seriously what Jesus actually said, or they shy away from looking at what Jesus actually said of how we should treat other people, especially if they disagree with us. Take this one as an example. Again, Jesus teaching the crowds, and he says, get with the times. Now, I think a lot of people in our current culture want to think that Jesus actually said that very thing, that we need to get with the times, that we need to adjust our teachings, adjust his teachings in accordance with whatever culture we're in. Now, obviously, Jesus taught within a culture, a specific culture, but a lot of those things that he taught aren't just for that culture, they're for all times and for all people. And so when we come to our time, and just because our culture says certain things are good, but then the scripture tells us that it's wrong, we need to lean in with what scripture tells us. If that is our guidebook for life, if that is our objective truth for all of life, we need to look at that and hold that into high esteem over whatever our culture tells us we need to deem as correct or deem as right, despite what the scriptures might tell us. So we need to continue to lean on the scriptures and not ever think that Jesus is telling us or has told us that we need to sort of get with the times, that we need to modernize our teachings in accordance with the culture. Now, these two things sound really ridiculous, right? They sound ridiculous when we say, oh, Jesus said this, when, in reality, it really actually just sounds crazy to think that he would say something like that. Now, take this one as an example, and this is what we're talking about today. Your doubting is dangerous. Your doubting is dangerous, and maybe this is something you think Jesus actually said. But let's take a look at what does this really mean? Now, in our common language, English language, we often use an idiom, we say, I doubt it. And normally it's not really in a serious sort of sense. Yes, we say it and we mean it when we say it, but it's not really in a sort of negative sort of a scenario that we say it, really. Usually when we say it, we usually mean something is unlikely to happen. Now, for me, I might think, okay, and I love eating out. We don't eat out a whole lot, but I love to do it. And I wish I could do it more often, but thankfully I have a wife who doesn't allow me to do that all the time. I like to eat out all the time, and so sometimes I might think to myself, okay, maybe I get to eat out tonight. And then I think, well, I doubt it, because we have a lot of leftovers at home, and so I doubt that we're actually going to be able to eat out because we have a ton of food at home that we need to eat up. And so again, we use that phrase, we say, I doubt it, but not too much in a negative sense. But what does that word actually mean, right? We don't mean that phrase in a really a negative sense, but what does that word doubt actually mean? And so when we look at it, when we talk about it, doubt It's a feeling of uncertainty or lack of conviction, right? A feeling of uncertainty or a lack of conviction. And so we bring that word into faith, right? We use that in English language as well, but we bring that into faith, bring that into our walk with God, our journey with God, and you might as well turn this word doubt into a 4-letter curse word. And you don't have to use your imagination for very long. I know this word is not 4 letters, but you don't have to use your imagination very much or for very long to know what I'm talking about. It might as well become that 4-letter curse word in some Christian circles. So many people believe that if you're a Christian that you shouldn't doubt. That doubt shouldn't come up and creep up into your life. If you really take this faith seriously, you shouldn't have any of those kinds of questions. But I think because there's so many misconceptions, I think there's a lot of people in Christian circles today, and outside of those, people who are skeptical, people who are agnostic, who have a lot of questions about faith. I think they're afraid to have questions. They're afraid to have doubts. And why are they afraid? Why are they afraid to have these types of questions about God? Well, I think it really comes down to 2 things. And I think we can actually probably expand this list, but I think it really comes down to these very 2 things. And I think the first of these is that doubting isn't for real Christians. Right? And the second thing, doubting challenges our idea of God. And so when we look at the first of these, that doubting isn't for real Christians, I think the misconception is that real Christians have great faith. Real Christians do not struggle, right? Real Christians have all the answers, and in a sense, they don't question God, and they just follow Him sort of blindly. But I think this goes against the Bible. I think this goes against a lot of the characters in the Bible that we see, especially in the book of Psalms, maybe even in the book of Job, where we see all these various people in the Bible, these figures in the Bible, who have serious questions about God, serious doubts about God. Maybe they doubt God's existence. Maybe they doubt God's goodness. Maybe they doubt whether or not God will do something. Maybe they doubt or question whether God can actually do something. Does He have the power to remedy the situation that they're in? But even going beyond the Bible, right, we come into more recent times, like people like C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is famous for writing the Chronicles of Narnia, but then even also writing some other sort of theological books like Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, A Grief Observed, many other books that he's written about, specifically about God. But we know in his life story that there were times where he doubted his faith, where he had some serious questions about God. But yet he worked through those things and became a real spokesman for God throughout his lifetime. You look at someone like Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa is probably one of the more famous Christian workers in all of the world. I think so many people know who she is, and she's worked in Calcutta, India, up into her passing. But while she was working there, she was a very faithful Christian, a faithful worker of God, a faithful servant of God, that she also had doubts. She questioned whether or not that God was actually with her. Like we see her diaries where she felt like she was alone. She felt as if God wasn't there for her, that God maybe wasn't fulfilling His purpose for her in her life. And so she had those doubts. She had those serious questions about God. And so I think for people who say that real Christians don't doubt, or that doubting isn't for real Christians, I think they call into question the faith of a lot of other people who have been considered pillars of the Christian faith, someone like Mother Teresa or someone like C.S. Lewis. So I think for you, if you're the type of person who has doubts, I have doubts, I have questions as well, right? It's okay to have questions, it's okay to have doubts. But if you're the person that also has doubts and has questions, I think you can look at all this and say, man, I'm in good company, right? All of these very famous Christians in the world, they had doubts, they had questions, and I do too. So you are in good company. So the second of these, that doubting challenges our idea of God. Now going back to C.S. Lewis often talked about how he felt like he was putting his faith at risk because he was what we call a Christian apologist, and so he would go and he would defend the faith, and so he did that to like Mere Christianity and many of the other books that he's written. But he always felt that his faith was at risk. Not that he would actually lose his faith, but he was putting his faith at risk for everybody else so that they can come to know the gospel. And so, but he had to do some really deep work into and research into the faith and really see maybe were there inconsistencies and all of that and reconcile all of that. But I think through all that, again, I think his faith got stronger because of it, because of the engagement he had to do with the scriptures and with other sources around the Bible to really figure out what is true, right? And is Christianity actually true? And does it reconcile everything, every problem, every struggle that we have? And so his faith was stronger because of it. Now, I remember when I was in college, or actually, let me take a step back, when I first became a Christian. And in the church that I became a Christian in, they often taught a certain position about a certain topic that really became very interesting to me. So when I first became a Christian at the age of 16, I was really engaged in and really interested in the whole idea about creation. Right? How did God do all of this, and in what time frame did he do it? And the church that I became a Christian in, they taught a certain position. And this is not right or wrong. I think a lot of people can fall on different places on the spectrum of what they believe about the creation of the world and how God did it. But they specifically taught like what we call a literal creation. That 6 or 7 day creation, that God created it in literal days here for our earth and our universe and all of that our earth is actually pretty young. But when I went to college, and I actually went to a Christian college, and when I was there, I began to learn other positions. And it wasn't like I was learning these positions from a secular university. I was learning these from Christian professors who were telling us that there are other ways to look at this. And so as I began to wrestle with it all, I began to question my own position. I began to question and challenge what I had been taught for all those years when I first became a Christian at this certain church. And so I questioned that position, but then, and part of me also wanted to question God, like, okay, if there's all these positions, what's really right? What's really true? But what I found is that as I researched, as I dug in, as I engaged the scriptures, this actually made my faith even stronger. Right? And yes, I may have changed my position a little bit, and that's okay. I mean, people fall on, again, different parts of the spectrum or different points of belief about this certain topic, and that's okay. But I think my faith became stronger because I was able, and I actually took action. All right? I didn't just have these doubts, I didn't just have these questions and just leave them there and let them settle in my heart. I actually went and tried to figure out what's actually right, what's actually true, and can we reconcile all these belief systems with the scriptures? And so I don't know where you are. I don't know what it is that you're dealing with. But my encouragement to you, and I hope this will encourage you today, is that if you have doubts, if you have questions, you're not doing yourself any favors by keeping them welled up inside your heart or welled up inside your mind. You've got to go and take them to God. Right? You've got to bring them to somebody who can really reconcile all of these questions, all of these struggles that we have. Kind of going back to the Psalms. A lot of these chapters that are in there about doubting, or where they doubt God's goodness, or they have questions about whether or not God's going to do anything, their doubts go somewhere, right? They don't just sit in their doubt and get so upset and angry and frustrated and anxious because they have these doubts. They take these doubts over to God. Because in almost every chapter, the way they end is they say, okay, I have all these questions, I have all these doubts, but yet I'm going to trust in you, God, right? I'm going to put my hope and faith in you. And so that's the thing that we have to do, is that if we have doubts, we have questions, our doubts and questions got to be pointed in the right direction, namely to be pointed towards God. Because God is the only one, and I think you'll find this as you work through your struggles, work through your questions, that Christianity really is the only faith out there that provides a sufficient and coherent solution to all the problems and struggles that we have in life. And so the story that we're going to read today, this particular story is in Mark chapter 9. And I think this picture that we get here of this father who is in deep desperation of wanting to help his son. But through that, what we see a picture of someone who doubts, right? Who's not quite sure what Jesus is going to be capable of doing in his situation. Is he going to be able to remedy the situation that he and his son are in? And I think this is an encouragement to each and every one of us who has doubts, who has questions, because I think we can see a little bit of ourselves in the story. And so we go to this chapter in Mark chapter 9, and here's how the story goes. It says, when they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. What are you arguing with them about? He asked. A man in the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. And so already we see this desperation of this father. He knows that Jesus' disciples, who have the power as well to be able to exorcise this demon from the son, that they aren't able to do it. And so he already knows, he's already desperate. He says they could not do it. And then Jesus says, and I think this is pointed at his disciples, he says, "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you?" He knows his time is short. He knows he's going to go to the cross very soon. "How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." And so they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." And man, isn't that the phrase that is really in the depths of our soul? When we have a question, when we have a doubt, and we think to ourselves, "God, but if you can remedy this solution, right? Or remedy this problem. You can provide a solution. If you can provide a coherent response, right, to my deepest heart questions. If you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." Or take pity on us and have compassion on us. And then Jesus sort of takes us as a challenge. If you can, Jesus said, or said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. And this is not necessarily saying that if you're a believer, that anything you say is going to happen, that anything you pray is going to happen. Right? We kind of talked about this last time when we talked about whether or not God answers all of our prayers, which may be a big misconception for a lot of people. But I think what this last phrase means, that everything is possible for one who believes, really goes into the fact that if someone who believes in God, right, if we have faith in God, if we trust in God, that we're really not putting any limits on what God could possibly do in our situation. Then the last of this section, immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." This is a really interesting sort of pairing we see here, that this guy believes, but then there's a part of him that has doubt. There's a part of him that doesn't believe what's actually going to happen. I think what it's saying here is that he believes Jesus will do something, but is unsure if he can actually do it. Just remedy the problem, provide a solution for his struggle. And then verse 25, when Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer." It's a question for you to think about, and here it is. What do you do when you don't know something? What do you do when you don't know how to do something? I'm sure there's something that you do. There's some response that you have. You know, I really envy kids. I really envy like little kids, like, you know, maybe kindergarten and under, or first grade and under kind of kids. I don't have a kindergarten or a first grader yet, so I'm not quite sure what kind of questions they ask, but I really envy little kids, because that's where we are sort of in our journey as a family. We have little kids. But I envy our daughter because she asks a lot of questions. And oftentimes, most of the words that come out of her mouth are questions. But she's not afraid to ask them. She doesn't shy away from asking the hard questions. You know, why is the sky blue? You know, there's probably a scientific answer, a reason why that's the case. But we don't know why. It's just always been blue. And so we say, "Well, honey, I don't know." And so, but she's not afraid to ask the question. Even easier questions that we might be able to solve. And she says, "Hey, I don't know how to tie my shoe. Can you tie my shoe for me?" And so, yes, we kindly do it for her, right? We tie her shoe, show her how to do it, right? So she's not afraid to do that. But somewhere along the way, somewhere along our journey as human beings, we became afraid of asking questions. I don't know what age that is. I tried looking it up, trying to figure out. Maybe it's different for everybody. Like, at what age do we become embarrassed? Do we become afraid to actually ask any questions? Now, I remember between the ages of like 8 and 16, you know, most summers I would go and help my stepdad work on custom homes, right? So that's what he was in. That was the kind of business he had, was custom home building. And I would go with him, and I would sort of be his helper. I didn't have any skills or anything. He would just tell me what to do. If he needed something, he would ask me to go get it. And more often, or most often during these times, when he would ask me to go get something from the truck, he would say, hey, can you go get this tool for me? Can you go get this one set of plans for me from the truck? And most often, I didn't know what he was talking about. Most often, I had no idea what it was he was asking me to go and do, asking me to go and get and bring back to him. But yet, I was afraid to ask questions. And it wasn't because there was going to be some punishment if I asked a question. I don't know. Maybe I just felt embarrassed. Or maybe I felt like people would think I was dumb or something because I didn't know what he was asking me for. And so I would go to the truck and I would take my time, like intentionally. I would sit there looking around, and I would, move things around as if I was intently looking, go in the back of the truck, open the seat up, open the glove box, do all of these things, take my time, and every now and then he might say, hey, Mark, you got the thing yet? And I'm like, yeah, I'm still looking. I'm not sure if it's here. Keep looking for it, take my time. And then after a long while, I would go back, and he would have already forgotten what it is he was asking for. And so the problem was solved, right? I never actually really had to ask a question. But I think that goes to show that there is some point in our life where we become afraid to ask questions. So I envy little kids, but as a follower of Jesus, I actually envy atheists. I actually envy agnostics. So people who don't believe in God, people who believe maybe there is some higher power but not quite sure what that is, right? I envy them because they're not afraid to ask the hard questions. They're not afraid to challenge long-held beliefs. They're not afraid to challenge faith. They're not afraid to challenge God. They're not afraid to question God's goodness. Right? Because one of the main doubts and questions and obstacles a lot of people have is about the evil in our world. Right? And if God is good, then why isn't he doing anything about it? Right? So they're willing to bring those questions to God, sort of fearlessly over to God, with courage and boldness to say, why aren't you doing anything about this? And until those things are reconciled, right, they don't bother even coming to follow God or wanting to believe in God. So these are some serious questions. These are some serious doubts that they have. And so I envy them. But you see, for followers of Jesus, I'm not sure if we're so courageous or so bold with our doubts, so bold with our questions. I think many times we're afraid to do it. We're afraid to ask questions, and maybe we do voice them sometimes, but I think a lot of times we keep those questions deep down inside of us. And I think that's really to our detriment, right? We need to be able to share these questions. We need an avenue in which we can ask, right? And honestly and humbly bring our doubts before God and before other people and really seek out to find answers. Now, the story that we read today, it's the story of this father. Right, the story of this father who's very desperate, who has tried going through Jesus' disciples to find a remedy to this problem that he has. But yet they're unable to do it. And then Jesus comes on the scene here. Jesus enters the scene, and he allows this father, right, the space to express his doubt, to express his concern. And here's what he says, Mark 9:22. And as often, so he's talking about his son, as often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him, the spirit or this demon that he wants exorcised from his son. But he says, but if you can do anything. So again, I think he believes that Jesus will do something, but is unsure if he's actually capable, right? Or if with his power, if he's going to be able to actually exorcise this demon. The disciples weren't able to, so maybe Jesus won't. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us, right? Have compassion upon us. And I think he's an example for all of us. For all of us who doubt, for all of us who have questions, I think he's a good example for each and every one of us. Right? Can he remedy this solution? Is the question that is on the mind of this father. And I think we can see sort of the same desperation, the same questioning, right, in our own doubts, right, in our own faith journey. Right? We think to ourselves, right, will God do anything? Right? And if God will do something, can he do something? Or can he do it? Can he provide a remedy to my problem? Can he provide for me a sufficient solution to my deepest heart questions? Can he save me? And maybe we think we're too far gone and we doubt, can God actually save me? Can God actually rescue me? So these are serious doubts. These are serious questions that we have. Now, many of us, we may actually voice those opinions, but there's also a lot of people who won't deal with them. They won't talk about them. Right? They won't take them to people that they trust, and let alone actually take them to God. And so what do you do? Right? There's a lot of people who might do certain things because of their doubts, but what do you do, right, when you have these doubts? You know, there was a survey done of all these people who had all serious doubts, had serious questions, and there's a lot of things that they did. So there's some physical consequences of all of this. As I said earlier, there's a sort of like a detriment if we keep these questions to ourselves. Now, what happened was when they surveyed all these people, what they found is that, or they asked the question, when you experience spiritual doubt, did you stop doing any of the following? And so if you look at all these numbers, you obviously look, they don't quite add up to 100%, because I think what it's showing us is that there's a lot of people who did more than just one thing. They didn't just stop going to worship, they actually probably stopped doing a lot of other things. So some people here stopped going to church, some people stopped reading their Bible, stopped praying, they stopped talking with friends and family. And then a small percentage of people didn't do any of those things. They may have done something negative, or they might have just not been, even keel as they went through their doubts or dealt with their doubts. But you found that the majority of people actually did something. So when they had their doubts, they had their questions, many of them sort of backed away from God. Many of them sort of quit doing the practices of faith and religion. Right? So they abandoned it really altogether. And so I think that's key for us as we think about what it is that we actually do. Right? When we have these doubts, when we have these questions. And I'm not exactly sure, what kind of doubts, what kind of questions that you struggle with, what kind of questions and doubts that you deal with. But maybe in your life, maybe in your faith journey, or your walk through this life, you may have gotten bad answers or insufficient answers to your deepest heart problems. Or maybe you just felt like God wasn't lending an ear, right, to whatever doubts and questions you had, and that because of that, you felt like you were afraid to ask. Or maybe the people around you made you feel bad for having the questions and doubts that you have, and so you think, well, I'm just not going to share it anymore. It's kind of going back to what we talked about earlier, how it's like there's a point in which we become afraid, we become embarrassed to ask a question. Right? Either because we don't want to look like we don't know anything, or afraid to sort of be humble about the fact that we don't have everything figured out. And I'll be the first to tell you, yes, I've studied a lot of this stuff. I've studied the Bible for years, but yet I don't come close to having all of the answers. I've certainly helped tons of people try to journey through different aspects, different struggles, different questions, but I am far from having all the answers to all of our heart's deepest questions. Well, we see this father who is looking for answers. And he finds his answer in Jesus. He brings his son over to him because he needs help. And here's what it says. Jesus takes it as a challenge. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. And that's, again, a very interesting pairing there. Because what we often think is that belief and doubt don't go hand in hand. That what's synonymous with unbelief is doubt. We think that if we are doubting God in some way, that maybe we aren't real Christians, maybe we aren't true Christians, maybe we don't actually believe in God. But I think that's quite contrary to what we see here, because this father, he believes, right, that Jesus will do something, but he doubts whether or not he can do anything. There's a big difference there. So belief is in play, but yet there's some doubts, there's some questions that this father has about Jesus. And I think even when we look at doubt, it really is a part of the faith journey, right? And I don't think this speaks contrary to that either. There's a famous philosopher by the name of Paul Tillich, and what he says is this. He says, doubt isn't the opposite of faith. It is an element of faith. I would say that, and maybe this is harsh, maybe this is kind of maybe a difficult way of saying this, or a blunt way of saying it, but I really do think that if you haven't had any doubts about God in your life, I'm not saying you have to have a doubt right now. I'm saying if you haven't had a doubt about God in your life, maybe about his goodness, maybe about his existence, maybe about his ability to do anything in your life. I think if you haven't had any doubts that you've struggled with or wrestled with, I'm not sure of the depth of your faith. I'm not sure if you really wrestled with the hard things about your faith, about God, if you have not had any doubts in your life. Because we know this Christian life isn't this sort of this line graph where you start at point 0 and you're all the way at 100. Right? Oftentimes you go up, you might have down times, you might go up, you might come down, you might go up, you might come down. Yes, you're going in an upward trajectory, but there are ebbs and flows to our faith. But yet, these doubts are a part of the Christian faith. Right? They're a part of our walk with God. They're a part of my walk with God. They're part of your walk with God as well. And I think the doubts actually make our journey with God worthwhile. Because when God pulls us out of the other side, when God provides that sufficient solution to our problem, right, or whatever we're struggling with in the deep parts of our being, of our soul, right, we find out that he could always be trusted, that he can always be faithful, and that just makes our faith even stronger as we go through it. Another guy named D.L. Moody. D.L. Moody was a famous American evangelist, and so he went around and he would have gatherings similar to what Billy Graham did, and he might do a message or a sermon and people would come to faith, right? He would give that invitation for people to come to faith. And in those sort of his messages and throughout his time here on earth, he wrote about our struggle with doubt and the types of faith that we have in the midst of doubt. And so here's what he says. He talks about 3 types of faith that we have. He says that we have struggling faith, that we have clinging faith, and resting faith. And I think the best way to look at this is sort of a picture of us sort of falling overboard from a boat. And so when we have struggling faith, we might be outside of the boat, and we might be struggling to stay above water, and so we ask for a life preserver. We ask for someone to throw us something, right, to save us. And then there's clinging faith, right? We get pulled into the boat and we're hanging on to the side of the boat and can't quite get in. And so we're clinging to the side for our dear life. And then resting faith is right when we get in the boat. All right? We're sort of just sitting in there and resting in the safety of the boat. We see in all of these, though, I think what's common in all of them is the fact that our eyes are always fixed on the boat. Our struggle is always faced towards the boat, right? We always know where our help is coming from. Now, I think for D.L. Moody, I don't think he means to say that we sort of start struggling faith. So maybe if you're a newer Christian, or maybe you're not a Christian yet, you're still searching, you're still seeking, and you're struggling through your faith, or struggling to come to belief in faith and to believe in God, and you move to clinging faith because you have some of your questions answered, and then you have all your questions answered, and so you're resting faith. Now, some people would say we never get to resting faith. We're always struggling or clinging. But I think that we're going to move between all of these throughout our walk with God. So we might at some point be resting in faith, right? We might say, okay, I'm doing really great in my life and I'm doing good. My relationship with God is great. And then something bad happens in your life, something that you cannot quite explain. And so you begin to question God's goodness. You begin to question whether or not God's going to do anything to remedy the problem. And so maybe you're clinging faith, right? Maybe you're thinking, man, like I have these truths to hang on to, right, of what God's going to do. And so I'm going to hang on to that even if he's not going to do anything. But maybe years go by. You think God's still not doing anything, and so you're like, man, I'm really struggling in my faith right now. I can't quite reconcile why God isn't doing anything. And so we're struggling through our faith, but yet our eyes are still fixed on God, knowing that He's the only one that can provide the ultimate solution to our deepest heart problems and struggles. So I think we move through all of these, right? My hope is that we don't stay in struggling faith and we don't stay in clinging faith, that for the most part throughout our life, we are resting in our faith. Now, sure, it's good to have questions. It's good to have struggles, right? I have questions. But yet I would say, and I would consider myself to be resting in my faith. To knowing that God, knowing that the Bible, that the gospel provides the only sufficient and coherent solution to all of life's problems, right? I'm resting in that. But yes, I still have questions or struggles that I deal with. And so I may, cling to some of the truths that I have, but still try to work through the problems. But my eyes are still fixed on God, knowing that He is the only sufficient one for my life. And so through all of this, whatever aspect of faith we find ourselves in, right, whatever point of faith we find ourselves in, we've got to point our doubts and our questions in the right direction. And that's what the Father did. The Father had these concerns, He had these doubts, right? But yet He trusted in Jesus. Right? He says, Lord, I do believe, but help my unbelief. In another sense, what he was saying there, he says, my faith is weak. Help me in spite of me. Right? It wasn't that he didn't have some faith in Jesus, but he had some doubts whether or not he could actually do something. And that's each and every one of us as we journey through this life of faith, as we journey through this life with God. And so how do we really deal with our doubts? How do we really kind of come on the other side or get to the other side, right, with our questions and our struggles? I think we first have, and this is practically speaking, I think just like every other sort of like recovery group, they'll usually say you need to admit. At first, there's admittance, right? You admit you have a problem. Now, I don't say doubt. I think doubting is okay. Honest doubting is okay. Honest questioning is okay. Right? So it's not a problem. But the first of these is we have to admit that we actually have doubts. We have to admit that we actually have questions. Whether it's to someone you trust or really bringing them then to before God, to put them in his hands, right? To trust him fully, to know that he is the only one that can provide a solution for your problems, right? Or to the questions that you have about life. Right? So we have to admit we have it and take it over to him. But then we also have to, on our own, right, embark on that quest for truth. And I think when you embark on that quest for truth, when we began asking hard questions, you began asking tough questions, talking to people you trust, sitting in prayer before God and saying, God, I don't understand. Help me to understand, Lord. Lord, I believe, but help me in my unbelief. Right? I believe you will do something. I believe you exist, but there's a lot of doubts. There's a lot of questions that I have about how it is you do things, or when it is you're going to do something, or why it is you didn't do something, or why it is you did something for that person and not for me. So there's a lot of these doubts and questions that we have. But we need to embark on that quest for truth. Right? Embark on that quest to sort of reconcile all of these questions that we have. So it's okay to challenge your beliefs. It's okay to challenge the teachings that you've been brought up with. It's okay to do that, so long as the direction and the person in which you give those doubts to, you give those questions to, is God alone. Because what you're going to find is that God handled the doubts of his people. Right? His people doubted him. The people in the Psalms, even Job and among other people, they doubted him, doubted his goodness, doubted he would actually do anything. And he handled their doubts with compassion, with care, and with love. So how much more could he care and love us as we take our doubts to him? Let's pray. God, thank you so much for how much you love us, how much you care for us, how you come alongside us, you grab us by the hand, and you help us work through all these questions and doubts that are in the deepest parts of our being. I pray, Lord, for anyone who's struggling, who is at a different point of faith, who maybe is not into faith yet, I pray, Lord, that you would reveal yourself anew to them. Show them, Lord, that you are the only one who can provide that sufficient and coherent solution to all of life's problems. Because, Lord, I truly believe that once we embark on that journey, when we look at all of the worldviews, all of the sort of ways of thinking in our world, that the only conclusion we're going to come to is that you are the only one that is sufficient for us. So I pray that that would be so for those people who are struggling, who have doubts, who have questions, and for me as well. Lord, thank you so much. We have this privilege as your children to come before you with these doubts, with these questions. Just like a little child, or like my daughter who comes to me with questions, Lord, I pray that for each and every one of us, that we can come to you with our questions and with our doubts, knowing full well that you can handle ours because you've handled your people's. So Lord, we love you, we thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.